Okay, so this video is for anyone who's wanting to get into golf club repair, golf club building. And very simply, I'm just gonna give you sort of a checklist in this video of things that you wanna make sure you're doing in order when you're building and repairing golf clubs. Let's go. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're having a wonderful day. So this video is just going to be sort of a simple outline of how to build a golf club. We are not going to get into all the details. I've got plenty of other videos you can go and watch the actual process of all the things that we do when we are building or repairing golf clubs. But what this video really is just the outline, just sort of a point of reference. If you are about to build a golf club, about to repair a golf club, take a quick look at this, make sure you've got all your steps in order, you know what you're doing, you know what you want to be doing, you know what the end result is or what you want it to be. And this, hopefully going in this order and not leaving anything off, will give you the best, most accurate, most professional results. First off, we're going to be dealing with the heads. Now, whether we're dealing with brand new heads like this or we're dealing with a reshaft, in either case, the first thing we're wanting to do is prep the heads. So if this is a golf club, say, that had a broken shaft in it, well, we'd clearly want to pull that shaft out. If it's just a new head like this, we can skip that step. But the next step we want to make sure is we prep the hosels. What that means, we just want to get all the debris out of here using a little wire brush, using a little sandpaper dowel, something like that. Clean out any of the residue. I also always go back with a little acetone on a Q-tip, clean it out a second time. Step number 2, we're going to weigh all of our heads. This just gives us an idea what we're dealing with. This is primarily when we're talking about irons or maybe wedges if we had a set of wedges. But we want to weigh all the heads and make sure that we have a good, steady progression of weight. Ideally, you want 7 grams basically between each iron. So 4 to 5, you'd have the 5 iron being 7 grams heavier, and they keep getting heavier as they get shorter. The next step is going to be cutting the shaft to the appropriate length. Now, here we have to make a differentiation between taper tip shafts and parallel tip shafts. A parallel tip shaft or a .370 shaft, what that means is you have to make 2 cuts. You're going to cut once from the tip side and you're going to cut once from the butt side. You cut from the tip side to determine how the shaft is going to flex and to match it up with whatever iron you're going to be putting it into. When it comes to taper tip shafts or .355 shafts, you aren't going to do that. That shaft is already pre-designed at the factory to go into a certain iron. So you have a 6 iron shaft for a 6 iron head, you have a 9 iron shaft for a 9 iron head, etc. So 370 parallel tip shafts, you're going to cut some amount from the tip section. Taper tip shafts, you will not cut anything. Wood shafts are all .335 at this point. But if we're talking about installing fairway wood shafts, well, in many cases, you are going to need to, once again, cut some section off of the tip to get it to play correctly in that fairway wood, just as a side note. Now, once we've made those tip cuts, or in the case of a taper tip, we've just prepped it because it's already ready to go, then we're going to need to cut or measure and cut from the butt end, and this is going to determine the final playing length of the club. So that is where we actually want to put the head and the shaft together and take a measurement and cut this shaft to the playing length. Remember, whatever length you're trying to hit, you want to subtract about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch off of that amount, because the end of the grip is going to add a little bit extra length to the club. Next thing we're going to be doing is prepping the tip of the shaft. If it's a new shaft, we're going to be roughing up the chrome. If it's a steel shaft, with some sort of sanding belt or sandpaper to get that tip section roughed up. If we're talking about graphite, then we're wanting to remove that outer layer of paint from the graphite shaft so that the epoxy has a good surface to bond to. Okay, next step, we're going to be weighing everything and figuring out swing weight. Specifically, this is for really irons and wedge sets, but you can also obviously do it if you're trying to figure out what the weight is on a fairway wood or a driver. But what we're going to be doing, or what I always do, is dry fitting it together and swing weighting it without the grip installed. Some people like to go ahead and put the grip on at this point so it's all ready and you can get the swing weight that way. I don't love that method, mainly because it just makes the club kind of unwieldy when you're trying to deal with it and get the epoxy on it and balance it and get it set on the rack to dry. It just adds a level of cumbersomeness to it that I don't love. So I don't put the grip on until the very end. I also don't even bother with a ferrule at this point. So whenever I'm doing swing weighting, I just basically factor in my head that there's no ferrule yet, there's no epoxy yet. Between the two of those, you're probably going to add about 1 swing weight point. But when I'm swing weighting, again, head and shaft together, I don't put the grip on as far as actually sliding the grip on, but I will take the grip, either a split grip you can do this with, or the actual grips you have, and just rubber band them onto the end of the shaft and install it into the swing weight scale like this. Now, whenever I do this, I always have a little bit of a gap between the end of the shaft and the backstop of the swing weight scale. And that basically mimics what happens when you actually put the grip on and you have that grip butt cap sticking out a little further. So it looks essentially like this when it's on the swing weight scale, and this usually sits up above it. And I get all my swing weights that way. Or if you want, you can get one this way, figure out what number you're trying to hit, and then you can take the grip off and just weigh it on the swing weight scale with no grip on it and match everything else off of it based on that number, realizing that, again, once you put the grip on, it's going to match up with what you originally did with this shaft. Now, once you've figured out what the swing weights are to start with, well, you might need to add a little weight either across the board or just with certain clubs. And in that case, we're going to be using either some little steel, well, these are brass, but these would go in steel shafts, or these, which would go in graphite shafts, to add a little bit of weight to the tip to try and get a little more balanced, a little more even, or just hit a certain swing weight number. Okay, essentially the last step before we epoxy everything together is we want to make sure we pick out our ferrules. Obviously, there's a lot of different kinds of ferrules. You may have a certain type that you are looking at or going to use, but if you haven't picked one and you're just trying to figure out which one is going to be easiest for you to deal with, well, you want to try and find one that has, obviously, first off, the inner diameter of that ferrule. Make sure it matches whatever the shaft is. So 335, we'd need a 335 ferrule for a wood. For an iron, either a 355 or a 370 ferrule, depending on a taper or parallel tip shaft. After that, the other number you want to look at is the outer diameter, that being this diameter right here, which you would ideally like to be somewhere similar to the outside diameter of your iron or your wood or whatever it is head that you're going to be using that ferrule with. Perfect situation, you want the ferrule slightly bigger so that we can then turn it down after we're all epoxied up. Now, if you don't want to deal with turning down ferrules, and when we get to that step you say, I just want to skip over that, a little trick I will give you is just pick out a ferrule that is fractionally smaller in its outer diameter than the hosel of that iron, so that you won't have to actually turn anything down. You won't have the lip of the ferrule hanging out past the edge of the hosel, but it still gives you a nice, clean, simple, finished look. Okay, next step is epoxying. We've got everything prepped. We've got our weights. We've got our ferrules. So now we're just going to glue it together. Very simply, we're just going to put a little bit of epoxy inside the hosel. Make sure we coat all the surfaces. We're going to put a little bit of epoxy all over the shaft where it's going to be making contact with the head. Again, don't overdo it. Do not over epoxy, just a very thin layer. Put a little bit of epoxy either inside the ferrule or a little bit of epoxy on the shaft before you slide the ferrule on if you're worried that that ferrule may start to creep up at some point in time. And then we're just going to put everything together. Make sure we tap it down after we've got it in there so that it's fully set, and then wipe off any excess epoxy. Get a little bit of grip solvent on a rag, wipe off any residue. Make sure you didn't put any thumbprints on the middle of a driver head or something like that that's going to be a pain to clean off later down the road. So, okay, we've got 3 steps left. Next thing we do after the epoxy is dry, I will always go at this point and do any of my loft lie adjustments. If you're going to be bending anything for loft or lie, I do them at this point before I turn down the ferrules. The reason for that is sometimes when you're messing around with clubs and you've got the bending bar, you can inadvertently brush up against a ferrule, scratch it, do something to it, and then you have to go back again and refinish it, re-clean it up. So better to do all your bending, if you're going to be bending for loft or lie, do that first while the ferrule is still in its raw state. And then when you're done with that, we move on to finishing the ferrule. So we do all the bending. Next step, we're going to turn down the ferrule. Obviously, I've shown you a few different ways to do this. I'll put a couple links down in the description below just in case you want to see the different versions or different ways of turning down a ferrule, either by hand or using some sort of belt sander. But in either case, you're just going to sort of finely take down the edge of that ferrule until it's smooth with the hosel, and then go back with a little bit of acetone on a rag and just wipe it very, very gently to bring the shine back to it. Okay, last step for me is I always put the grip on last. Now, again, some people like to put the grip on much earlier. Either they put the grip on before the club is epoxied, or maybe they put the grip on after it's epoxied, but before they bend it and turn down the ferrule. Again, for me, it just adds a lot of extra weight to the end of the club and makes it harder to handle, harder to deal with, especially when I'm trying to do something like turn it down on my belt sander. It's much easier to turn down a golf club when it doesn't have a grip on it. It's just easier to deal with. You don't have all that counterbalance there. So I always leave putting the grip on for the very last step. So there's your checklist. If you go down this list in order, I think you will have your best chance of finishing with a good, solid, professional looking golf club. Other people may move some things around, they may do it in a slightly different order, but I think especially if you're getting started, going in this order will give you your best chance of success. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, please go down below, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell icon so you'll be alerted when I post new videos. Make sure you check me out over on my new channel at Elite Fit Golf, where we're doing all sorts of videos on equipment and club fitting. You can find me on Instagram at Mobile Club Maker, and I'll see you next time. Bye.